Welcome, everyone. Feel free to finish getting food and come on in. But for everyone who's here, we are glad to be back for the semester. And for anyone joining online live, congratulations on finding the new stream. We're sorry that there were some problems with audio through some new technology that we have, and this is the first talk of the semester. So we will record this. If you're finding this later on, we'll record it and post it. And we'll also post Professor Barfield's slides, if that would be okay, because they may be a bit washed out on the live stream. Yeah, we'll turn out the front lights. Yeah, that will help with that too. Great. So welcome back. For those who don't know, my name is David Buckley. I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here at the University of Louisville, where I also direct the Center for Asian Democracy. And we're so glad to get our spring semester off to a very cold start this morning. It seems optimistic to call it the spring semester, with a talk on governance, imperial legacies, and state power in Afghanistan. And we're so pleased to have Professor Thomas Barfield here for this talk, one of the world's experts on these topics. I also just want to briefly thank our graduate assistant at the Center for Asian Democracy, Riaz Nasiri. Riaz is Afghan himself and was very enthusiastic to have Professor Barfield join us. And we're so glad to have Riaz with us as a member of our program and supporting the center. It's good to have this talk. Actually, one of our first events after I took over directorship of CAD in the days when everything was virtual was a virtual panel that we did on the fall of the post-Taliban regime and the return of the Taliban to power. And so it's very good to be able to return to these topics with a slightly longer view now that we've had a couple of years to also process what's happened since and what happened before. As always, we'll have Q&A afterwards. For those who may be watching live, I'm not sure if anyone is, but we will monitor the chat still, so you can still get your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll get those to the discussion as well. Let me introduce our speaker today. Professor Thomas Barfield is professor of anthropology at Boston University. He is a social anthropologist who has conducted extensive ethnographic field work among the pastoral nomads of northern Afghanistan, as well as shorter periods of research in Xinjiang, China, and post-Soviet Central Asia. After a period when research in Afghanistan was not feasible in 2001, his research returned to Afghanistan, focusing on law, government organization, and economic development issues, on which he has written extensively since. He's the author most recently of Shadow Empires, in Alternative Imperial History from Princeton Press, and is also an author of Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History, which was first printed in 2010 and has, I think just in the last couple of years, come out in an updated second edition, which is one of the real sort of classic texts now on governance in Afghanistan. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow in 2006 and received any number of other accolades for his scholarship and leadership in this area. He's also the longtime president of the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies, and one of the world's real leaders in thinking about politics, governance, and development in this very important setting. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. It is colder here than in Boston. So, I think if this is the South, but not South enough. So what I'd like to focus on today is kind of governance and empire in Afghanistan, but really taking terms of a long-term perspective. What makes Afghanistan stable and what makes it unstable? Focusing much more than political science perhaps do on the earlier periods, because I believe they give us lessons for understanding Afghanistan even today. Afghanistan got the reputation as graveyard of empires. It turns out that phrase did not appear in print till like 1983. But it's a kind of thing that resonated so much that people assume it must be true, it must be old. In fact, pre-19th century, Afghanistan was not a graveyard of empires. It was a highway of conquest. And if you look at this list, Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, Kushans, Mahmud Ghazni, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, Mughal India, they conquered and stayed in Afghanistan. Now, it is true that there's certain parts of Afghanistan, particularly along the border with Afghanistan, the northwest frontier, tribal areas into Afghanistan, and people here proudly announce, we've never been conquered by anybody. which is true because conquerors said, why do we even want you guys? Even the British, the Mughals, got tired of fighting the Pashtuns around the Khyber Pass and said, what would it cost to rent it? And they said, well, everything what we steal plus 10%. British said, fine. And even today, if you go to the Khyber Pass, it says closed after dark. And I thought, yes, because the traffic is really bad and be very dangerous. I realized that actually came from the treaty. Is Afghans cut a hard deal and they say, okay, it's free, you won't attack anything during the day. So officially it's closed after night. But the thing about this is northwest frontier of today's Pakistan, Afghan border, the British Empire at the height of its imperial glory never tried to conquer this place. It's just not worth it. So when we're looking about Afghanistan, graveyard of empires, it's really, we have to understand what are people conquering and why. And historically, what were the successful patterns of conquest and rule? What made governments legitimate? Political scientists talk about this a lot, but in the pre-modern period, legitimacy was established by winning wars. Whoever could take and hold power was legitimate. And who were the people that brought you to power? Not the masses, but military, mostly your personal clients and mercenary troops. Those of you who have read Sadi and Persian poetry has a number of things about shahs. And one of the things he says, pay your army that it may be brave in fight. Pay it not, it will be brave in flight. Mercenary armies, Mamluks, these were professionals. If we look at early Europeans expansion, we see also professional armies. You would besiege a city, and when they realized the city's going to fall, you would surrender. Why kill people? We're professionals. This is the way it was. And similarly, how do you determine you're legitimate? In Islamic jurisprudence, you minted coins and you had the khutbah, the Friday sermon made in your name. Of course, if somebody else could do that, they were legitimate too. All right? So we've got to realize that the question, consent of the governed have to be, they were like sheep. Do sheep hold the vote on who gets to be shepherd? No. All right? This is how it was looked at. And the Seljuks actually talked about this, and they said, to be an ordinary person, all you have to do is worry about your family and stuff. To be a shah, you have to worry about power. You know, they said ordinary people should not be condemned for this. They're just like a different species. So it's really, really important. In the modern period, we look upon the people, consent to the governed. This is not the way if everybody is going to be governed by outsiders, and it's not going to be you. What kept dynasties in power in Afghanistan? Royal charisma. What you found is when you took power, the people that were most likely to put you out of power were not some outsiders, were not some peasants, were not some people in the hills. It was your cousins, it was your uncle, it was your relatives. These were the danger because they had the right. If they could succeeded you, they were also legitimate. They had the right lineage. So wars of secession, particularly you see this in 19th century Afghanistan, only between relatives. 19th century Afghanistan looks full of civil wars, but ordinary people are not involved. It's brothers, it's half-brothers, it's uncles killing one another, blinding one another. But for ordinary people, not our business. So this actually produces a fair amount of stability because everybody is not involved in war. It's none of your business. Ordinary people have no role in government. Is there any analogy we have to this? Yes. Okay, if you're working for a corporation and it's taken over by some other corporation, do they vote to the workers? Do we wish to have Mercedes-Benz take control of Ford? No, we don't ask them. It's none of your business. That's the way politics was. Much like corporation. Hostile takeover, it helps and hurts the front office. Even though it affects you, you have no role in it. Now, the other thing that's really important to think about Afghanistan, and nationals do not like to focus on this in any country, is that every country writes Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, 5,000 years of history. That's really popular. 5,000, we're really old. The territory, summer capital Kabul. The Mughals did that, so did the Kushans. A dyad, Kandahar, and actually the other one, Sistan. Sistan used to be a great place, and for whatever reason, it just totally went out. It's all desert now. But if you look at the Shah Nama and other places, it's a big place. Herat, Western Afghanistan, one of the Persian Empire's provinces, and a place of its own. Whenever these places are destroyed, they come back. Sometimes what we consider Afghanistan is all within an empire. This is the Achaemenid Empire, 5th century BC. That little circle shows you today Afghanistan, a set of provinces within the Persian Empire. Yeah, you can take Afghanistan back to the Persian Empire, but it's not Afghanistan. It's provinces of the Persian Empire. And that's a very, very different dynamic. But often what happened was contested frontiers, particularly in the early pre-modern period. Look at the 17th century, we see Afghanistan is divided between the Uzbeks in the north, the Safavids in Iran, and the Mughals in India. That line that you see, Kandahar went from the Mughals to the Safavids. And they actually liked the Safavids better, even though they were Sunnis, because they got better treated under the Iranians than they did under the Mughals. But if we're looking here, Afghanistan does not exist. Not only does it not exist, the core regions are now frontier core regions where there's going to be fighting. In the ancient Persian Empire, there's not going to be any fighting. They're all part of the same place. So it's really important if we're looking at the territory of Afghanistan, at any particular time, what was it composite? Do not assume, as a nationalist would, that our country has always been here and always will be here. For 2,500 years, the core regions of Afghanistan have existed, have prospered. Dynasties, empires come and go. These places remain. And we'll see they'll still be important in 21st and I would argue in 22nd century Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was always part of usually some other polity. Being a separate place was new. Now, how do you rule a place like Afghanistan? And I have my infamous cheese model. The Persians come up with this. They have a Swiss cheese model. Swiss cheese, every slice is unique. Okay? You rule the cheese and ignore the holes. How do you do this? Holes are places that are not worth ruling. So you have multiple sets of laws and administrative systems. You have one system to deal with people in the mountains. You have another system to deal with people in the cities. You also ignore the places on the periphery because they're not worth ruling. You control them with policies of indirect rule. The United States sent an army into Nuristan. Do they ever wonder why the Afghans never sent an army into Nuristan? Number one, it's a cheese hole. Okay. Number two, how do the Afghans get cooperation with people high in the mountains? You put 10 guys at the end of the valley and say nobody goes in or out until you guys agree to better behave for us. And without salt, without cloth, without metal, those people are in real trouble. Indirect. The Turco-Persian model, the Swiss cheese model, was how you ruled the entire Achaemenid Empire, and it's one that the Afghans inherited. So some places are more important than others. Only about 12% of Afghanistan's territory is useful for irrigated agriculture in cities. The rest of it is fundamentally cheeses. American cheese model. In American cheese, every slice is uniform. If you see a hole in cheese, you send it back. A rat ate my cheese. This is bad cheese. A government's job, if it sees a hole, is to fix the cheese. There's a single administrative system for all regions of people. The periphery must be made to obey the center. Direct rule is the default. This is the model that China and Rome use. Right? Particularly China, because China, the resources are all pretty much evenly distributed. The Persians, no, it isn't distributed. So in Afghanistan, the term for rebel is Yagi. So land of rebels is Yagistan. But if you call it land of rebels and you use the American cheese model, we must put down the rebels. Because Max Weber has told us a state has total control over all the territory within it. The Persians would say, no, it's a cheese hole. Okay. We don't need control. They would use the same term Yagistan, if you translate it into English, as land of autonomous people. Land of people we don't govern. But it's not a challenge. We don't need to govern them. In fact, we control the markets. We control the trade routes. They've got to come to us. And that's why the British Empire never bothered to make the Pashtun tribes along the border with India, even though they had the most troops in India on that border, they cut deals with them. Did they tax them? No. What do they want? A couple goats? No. They sent subsidies. They only sent troops there when rebellions broke out. Okay. You pick the wrong cheese, you're on the path to failure. And both for the Soviets and the Americans, imperial powers going into Afghanistan, they picked the American cheese model and spent all of their time attacking places that were of no value, and then wondering why it didn't work out. Okay, if you're also a pre-modern ruler, how do you rule? Well, you don't ask too much of people. You keep domestic order inside and discourage rivals. You devolve power regionally. You create patronage networks. You use divide and rule. Also, importantly for Afghanistan, and that's true of Afghanistan today, you do not tax the Afghan people. You take revenue from the outside, from trade, from raids, from wars, from subsidies. Every Afghan regime, when people say, what is an Afghan regime going to become self-supporting? Answer, never. Where they get the money from, Ahmad Shah Durrani raided India a dozen times. The British bought Afghan loyalty with subsidies. The Soviets and Americans poured money into it to such an extent that for more close to 300 years, Afghanistan has never paid for a government. Outsiders pay for it. When the British first went into Afghanistan and they looked at the remnants of the empire that was there, they said Ahmad Shah Durrani created this empire and he raised troops in Afghanistan and his revenue from India. This is an unusual empire because usually the most valuable parts are in the center and the periphery is less valuable. Afghanistan is like a coat worn inside out, right? The less valuable parts where you raise troops are at the center and the most valuable parts are on the outside. So the important thing is don't ask too much of the people and also don't do too much. Doing too much can create a problem. What's doing too much? Well, it turns out that this pre-modern model worked kind of well until the Europeans, particularly the British, arrived. But the Russians will also be coming in from the north. There's two Anglo-Afghan wars in 1839 and 42. The first, 1878 to 80. The British easily win both times, and then it blows up in their faces. It does not blow up in their faces because of great battles, but because their very invasions produce economic and social changes that they are unable to deal with. You got huge inflation. When an army marches in, the amount of inflation in a subsistence economy goes to the roof. The people of the old regime that used to get salaries, they're worthless. Traders, other lowlifes, they make a fortune. Mullahs in the first Anglo-Afghan war preached that as long as there was an Afghan sovereign, it didn't matter that the people supporting him were infidels. Why? Because the British paid them. What happens when the bill for a war comes due in a major imperial power? They say, you guys got to cut expenses. The wars are over. What's the first expense any imperial power covers? Giving money to the Afghans. They maintain their cigar subsidy. They maintain their, when they stopped paying mullahs, they got religion. What are the infidels doing here? And more importantly, they stopped paying the Ghilzais, who control the trade routes in and out of Afghanistan. And when they stopped doing that, they went to war. And they underestimated the political dangers in this, and they got destroyed. But the withdrawals from Afghanistan, even when armies were defeated, were always political. They were made in London, St. Petersburg, Moscow, or Washington. Okay. They were not made by the guys on the ground. So what we find here is this political decision. Even after the horrible destruction of the first British Army in 1842, that's where Afghan histories end. Yeah, but 6 months later, the British came back and they burned down Kabul. And the emir they left behind, the Shah they left behind, said, good, I'm glad you're here because I can continue ruling. He said, no, we're leaving. We just wanted to show that you could beat us once, but we can always come back. But it's a political decision. The Soviets all said we were never beaten by the Afghans. The Americans said the same thing. The Afghans said, we don't have to beat you. We just have to make you want to leave. What was the Afghan experience from these Anglo-Afghan wars? The most important thing from a political science point of view is the opposition came from rural insurgents, not the elite. Remember, I talked about the elite ran the place before, didn't it? In order to get rid of the British, you had to mobilize the people in the countryside. Tajiks from the north of Kabul, Ghilzai Pashtuns from the east, these are the people who take the lead. It's the first time a popular revolt plays a key role in Afghanistan. And from that point on, it's realized you can only get rid of foreigners by mobilizing the population. In fact, it turns out the elite is usually in bed with the foreigners. There's also a new criteria for political legitimacy. Religious dimensions, we're in defense of Islam. Nationalist dimensions, we have a country to defend. The interesting thing is in both Anglo-Afghan wars, and we'll see the same thing happens with the Americans, the power is always returned to the old royal line. Even those are people that sold the country out in the first place. Why? Because nobody can agree on who else would be ruler. The other thing that makes insurgencies deadly at this point is a change in technology. The mountain tribes now have muskets and rifles. Before they had little swords and spears. And can be mowed down by cavalry. Now you can sit behind a rock and shoot people. This gives people on the periphery a much greater military power than they ever had before. Well, at the end of the 19th century, when the British leave, they appoint, and we'll see every time a foreign group leaves, they always appoint a ruler. They appoint Emir Abdurrahman, who says, give me money, give me weapons, and I will make the Afghans obey. Internally, he keeps Afghanistan isolated, economically underdeveloped. He destroys regional autonomy. He plays ethnic and religious cards. He creates the Afghan national state. The only time really successful in its history. And future leaders, including Ashraf Ghani, will look upon the state that Abdurrahman created as, that's what we want. And after Abdurrahman creates this, he dies peacefully in bed. 1901. He was very proud to have lived longer than Queen Victoria. The interesting thing is, after 1901, not a single Afghan ruler will die peacefully in bed while ruling Afghanistan. Every one of them will be murdered or exiled. We're talking like 120 years now. We'll get into that momentarily. But the thing that happens in the 20th century that's new for Afghanistan is Afghanistan, actually, it does this earlier than either Turkey or Iran, but the idea that what we need to do is modernize the country. That Islam is an obstacle. The reason the Europeans are winning is because they gave up religion. They gave up Christianity. Let the Pope run the Vatican. Let secular people run the Vatican. Maybe this is a good idea. So we see Amanullah in the 1920s seeking to change Afghanistan. Emir Abdurrahman, yeah, he was a tyrant. He destroyed every kind of political autonomy. But the one thing he didn't do, he didn't interfere with how people lived. He was an old-fashioned. I don't care how people live, as long as they don't cause me trouble. 1920s, we see throughout the world with the idea that a modern state has education. 1929, it blows up. We get resistance from Islamic clerics, others, and Habibullah Kalakani, who is majority called Bachasakal, son of a water carrier, rules for 9 months. Why is he thrown out of power? Because his allies, the Pashtuns in the east, that were also rabid conservatives, said it's one thing to get rid of a modernizer like Amanullah, it's another thing to replace him with a Tajik bandit. So they ally with the royal dynasty. And they put in Nader Shah. The British allowed him to raise troops that then looted Kabul. This provides 50 years of boring conservatism. You can always tell if you look at the currency, these guys are all have pattern baldness. Okay, it's like if you look at the currency, they grow balder and balder. You know? For those who are really old, Daoud there looks a lot like Telly Savalas. You know,
It looks like Jeff Bezos.
But this is condemned by many people because Amanullah attempted to women's rights, education, opening Afghanistan up. These guys, not so fast. For 50 years, including the Second World War, Afghanistan is not involved. They saw Iran occupied by the British and the Soviets. They saw Iraq taken over by the... And even though they were pro-Nazi, it's like, okay, no. When you guys win, we'll put up the Nazi flag. All right. We're not sure you can. And they didn't. This is it was presumed, it was called a golden age today. If you lived there, Daoud Khan that you see there, I was in Kabul in 73 when he was overthrown. It was a bloodless coup. And nobody said anything good about Daoud. About Zaire Shah. The most interesting, every picture of Zaire Shah disappeared because everybody had a picture of the king. 2 days later, everybody had a picture of Daoud Khan. I said, wow, how do Afghans get pictures so fast? They said, he was prime minister for 10 years, so we had his picture. I said, in Afghanistan, never throw out a picture. You may need it again. So why is this government stable? And I say it uses the Wizard of Oz approach. It portrays itself as all-powerful, but avoids conflict wherever possible. They had military parades. They had MiGs. They had tanks. They never used that army. People always thought that army's really powerful. Maybe we should. But they never gave them a reason to do it. But many people, both on the radical left, the communists, but also on the Islamic right, Muslim Brotherhood type, said, by God, we've got to get rid of this monarchy and create a real state that has a real ideology. Ta-da, the communist takeover. There was some mistake. God sent 2 angels, and one angel had instructions, you will create a communist regime. And the other one was, you will create an Islamist regime. So when they get back to God, he said, deliver the message? Yeah. So how's it working out? Great. Iran is Islamic Republic and Afghanistan is communist. God says, guys, you switched the message. I mean, like, if any place was going to be communist, it would be Iran. If any place was going to be Islamist, it would be Afghanistan. So anyway, this is what happens. So the communists take control. The interesting thing is, I talk about outsiders. Yes, they're radical communists. They're all Eastern Pashtuns. They're going to get rid of these Duranis. And then they start killing each other. So we say, well, we don't put them in power. But they immediately, what's the first thing they do? Is they purge people within their own movement not deemed radical enough. Over 11,000 people are executed in the first months. The prisons are full, and they call for immediate and radical change, and it's met with, for the first time, nationwide resistance. The rebellions against the British in the 19th century were always localized. This is nationwide. So let's call in the Soviets. The Soviets said, okay, we'll come in, we'll be here for 6 months, be like Czechoslovakia, we're back at home again for Christmas. They invade in Christmas, they're there for 10 years. 1 million Afghans are killed, 3 to 5 million as refugees. The economy is destroyed. It's a stalemate. The Mujahideen cannot defeat the Soviets. The Soviets can't get rid of the Mujahideen. And Gorbachev says, we're getting out. I'll come back to how he did that later. Let's go to the next invasion, 2001. Afghanistan has had a civil war. The Taliban are there. 9/11 happens. The U.S. goes in. It does not blame Mullah Omar. It says, you turn over Al-Qaeda to us and you can oppress women however you want. Mullah Omar refuses. The Americans invade. The Russians in the New York Times say, quagmire, we couldn't do it in 10 years. You guys are toast. The Taliban are gone in 10 weeks. When I saw the Afghan government collapse in 2021 and President Biden said, how could an army like collapse? We spent so much money. Mullah Omar asked himself the same question. Where are the Taliban? We've just been invaded by infidels. And it's like, your problem, Mullah, not ours. And what we had was high-tech military strikes, low-tech cavalry strikes. Those guys had laser pointers. Point a laser, tank disappears, which is why you can take cavalry. But it was Afghans on the ground. There were only 400 American and Brits on the ground when that war ended. The Afghans did the deals. They never lost their sovereignty. And the strange thing happens. It's like Afghanistan has a reputation. George Bush told us they have a reputation. They don't like foreigners. You went to Afghanistan and said, thank God you're here. One warlord said, we were invaded by the poor superpower last time. Now we're invaded by the rich superpower. Congratulations for getting rid of the Taliban, but you can't leave until you fix the country. So if you fix the country, they won't be any trouble. Don't, they will. But we said the Afghans did the deals. They fought on the ground without having to give up the country's sovereignty. It wasn't like Iraq. The Americans expelled the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan without employing any regular ground troops. This annoyed the American army because there was no medals. So they found a war which became America's longest war. But there was assumptions when the Americans came in that the two groups saw each pass. North American expectations, individual is the basic unit. Religion is private and free choice. The Kabul government is good. Afghan expectation, the community, not the individual, is the basic unit. Religion is public, fixed, and Islamic. The government was great. We will not discriminate against any Islamic sects. Yeah, can you become a Christian? No, we will kill you. You'll be a hostage. They had signed the UN Declaration of Human Rights that said religion is free. Yeah, free to be any kind of Muslim you want. For Afghanistan, that's a great step forward. All right? That's not how the North Americans looked at it. Also, Afghans have always seen any government in Kabul as suspect. Nothing good can come out of it. So the fact that the Americans say, we will put everything in the American government because that's how you build a state, that was asking for trouble. There was also differences in standards of legitimacy. The internationals focused on national level politics. Elections were the key to political legitimacy. Afghanistan had more elections than practically any country on earth. Constant elections. But in an unstable situation, elections are actually destabilizing because there's zero-sum games. One side wins, one side loses. In Afghanistan, they didn't care who got to be leader or what the process that made the people leader. What they were interested in is, what does that leader do? So one of my Afghan friends said, used to visit as a mujahideen, raising money and other stuff from Christian conservatives. He says, oh, you Americans, Christians, you pray before the meal. We Afghans pray after we've eaten it, which I was again thinking about, yeah, in Afghanistan, we would always pray when the meal was done. Wouldn't ask God's blessings before we hadn't eaten it. That's the way they looked at it. They viewed the actions taken by new institutions officials as the most important criteria for, is this government going to be successful? And it was the officials and government policies that were not working. They didn't care how they were chosen. As far as the US and the EU were concerned, if it's elections, it's legitimate. The Afghans said, we don't care about elections. What we care is, what are the kind of people that got into office because of it? So both under Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, corruption. Government is undermined with corruption and fraud. It's commonly said that more money was spent in Afghanistan than on the Marshall Plan. Yeah, but none of that money got to Afghanistan. If it had been, Afghanistan would have the best interstate system in all of Asia. They still have one crummy 2-lane road. All right. The money never left here. It all went into the pockets of internationals who were supposedly spending it on Afghanistan. But this alienated both the Afghans and, it turns out, the sponsors. But if your government is based on corruption, how can you fix it? If that's the glue that's holding it together, you can't end it. Now, this leads us to foreigners entering and leaving Afghanistan. Every foreign group entering Afghanistan, the leader they put in power is always a weak personality. Why? Because they'll do what you say. That's the kind of person you want. I'm not going to go over these guys. You can read in my book. Shah Shuja, infamously first. Amir Yaqub, second Anglo-Afghan, Babur Karmal. These guys were all seen as puppets because they were put in power by foreigners. The thing is, when the foreigners left, they said, we've got to replace these guys with somebody that has half a chance of ruling this country. So in the first Anglo-Afghan War, Dosman, the very king that they had thrown out of power, he went to India, went to Calcutta, and he waited for the British to have a disaster, and the British said, why don't you go back? Yeah, he went back, he ruled the country for the next 20 years. Abdurrahman, that state builder, the British also put him in power. And Najib, he added Ullah to his name, make it a little more Islamic. He was head of security. When Gorbachev leaves, don't find a committed, and Babur Karmal was a committed socialist. He was a true believer. Najib's nickname was the Bull. And he was a great speaker. And he also said, when you leave, I'm going to abolish the Communist Party, which he did. He renamed it the Watan Party. No communists here, no Russians here. And he told the people, so why are we killing each other? The Mujahideen were unable, they attacked Jalalabad, they fail. There's a stalemate. Ashraf Ghani. Americans also put him into power. He's a technocrat, used to be an American citizen. But he definitely falls on the left. Now, the Taliban can say, yeah, he's one of those foreign put-in persons. All the people on the right were also put into power by foreigners. Guys on the right are heroes in Afghan history. They also owed their positions to foreigners. The question was, when the foreigners left, they said, I got rid of the foreigners, and I kept their money. Okay. There's a lot to be said for that. So when the United States was pulling out, that crummy deal that Trump does, if Biden is going to do it, 3 previous foreign armies have invaded Afghanistan, and 3 have left. America will be number 4. There's very few places in the world in political science where the same experiment has been done 3 times. Okay? All the 3 left stable regimes. Najib outlasts Gorbachev. His regime doesn't fall until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev gave him 6 months. He beat the Soviet Union. If you're going to get out, maybe Ashraf Ghani is not your guy. Maybe you need a security guy. His vice president was a security guy. You could have gone. You've got to do it. But the Americans, no, it's an Afghan choice. That's not how the Afghans looked at it. But if you're going to leave, you've got the money, the weapons. You got to have somebody that has a certain amount of political legitimacy and is willing to live or die in Afghanistan. If you are a person that's putting money in bank accounts abroad, you are looking to flee. All the people on the right were saying, yeah, it's a tough place to rule, but I'm willing to put my life on the line to do it. The United States chose not to do that. So when it's collapsed, is any surprise? Because you had a leader that cut and ran. Not only did he cut and ran, he did not know how to run a government, and you didn't have a foreign army to protect you. So that leaves us with the Taliban arriving at the presidential palace, with Ashraf Ghani's uneaten lunch still there. And so when people said, well, why didn't they defend Kabul? Why didn't the army defend Kabul? It's because when you do not have trust in your own government, why die for it? But the other bigger takeaway in Afghanistan is, okay, the Republic is gone. The Taliban are back. What are the Taliban feeling really lucky? Can they really survive? We've gone through kings, commissars, presidents, amirs. Now we're back to amirs again. But doesn't mean they're there forever. Let's wait and see. Because Afghanistan may not be the graveyard of empires, but it is the graveyard of analysts. Anybody that predicts what's going to happen in Afghanistan will be mightily embarrassed. Because everything that you think you know from the past, that you say, this is what's going to happen, something different will happen. I'm not going to step into that graveyard, but what I can say is the Taliban have the same problem as any other regime in Afghanistan. Despite having defeated the United States provides the Taliban with $2 billion a year in humanitarian aid to feed its people. The Taliban may not care whether its people starve. The international community does. But the great danger is, because they're happy to see Donald Trump back. I mean, they snookered him once. That's like a second chance. The great danger is Donald Trump could say, why should we bother feeding them at all if Afghanistan starts starving? Can that government be stable? Because no government in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, is stable on its own resources. And despite being in power close to 3 years, the Taliban have not been recognized by a single government. They're people that do business with. Not a single government has recognized them. Moreover, the people that brought them to power in Pakistan. We finally have a government that we control in Kabul. And what's the first thing they did? Is give American weapons to terrorists that want to bring down the government in Pakistan. Pakistan is now bombing Afghanistan. India has recently hosted the Afghan foreign minister because it may be opposed to everything the Taliban can do, but if they become enemies to Pakistan, maybe we can do business. So Afghanistan is a very difficult place both to predict, but also it's not a place that's inherently unstable. But if you understand what brings people to power, what loses people to power. What you find is those that lose power most regularly have an ideological agenda, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's the US-backed republic, whether it's the communists that want to change Afghanistan and then don't have the capacity to bring it about. Stability comes to Afghanistan when usually foreigners and others are gone and Afghans can settle their own differences, which do not involve telling each other how to live. So one of the things in terms of looking at Afghanistan is to what extent will the Taliban recognize that themselves and bring about stability? And to what extent will they make some kind of mistake in the future that brings about a collapse that scholars like myself will explain was inevitable, that we couldn't predict, but in retrospect, had to be that way. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks so much. Happy to open the floor for questions. And for those who are online, I'll take a look at the chat online in just a second. I'm not sure if that's working. I'm happy to kick things off. I mean, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about, in the last couple of years, when it comes to the internal governance strategies of the Taliban out there back in power, like what would you say those indicators are in terms of, is this a kind of ideologically dedicated movement that's going to sort of go for centralization, go for uniform purchase of power, or is it going to govern actually as a more kind of Swiss cheese model, mixed sovereignty kind of approach?
This is a question of who do we think is running the Taliban? The conservatives in Kandahar, with Akhundzada as their leader, radical. He's the one with all women can't be employed, girls can't go to school. Most of the Taliban, that's not a particular issue. It's maybe the school should be segregated, maybe they should women teach, but they're not that hard line. And many Taliban are hypocrites. Their own daughters are going to school in the Gulf. But the ones in Kabul, the Haqqanis, they're not mullahs. All right? They're garden variety, these days, terrorists. But they're practical ones. They're the ones, if we allow girls to go to high school, and it brings billions of dollars to support our state, open the girls' schools. How many are going to go? Like, this is easy. Why make a deal of it? Because they're not into Islam. They're into power. The ones that we know even less about are those in the north. There's a lot of non-Pashtuns that are involved, or in the west. They were the ones that helped the Taliban come to power. And culturally, they've never been as conservative as the people in Kandahar. In many of those places, girls do go to school. Taliban turn a blind eye. These don't listen to the edicts that come out of Kandahar. The one thing, in terms of total control, yes, there's no more war in Afghanistan, although the Islamic State does terrorist attacks against the Taliban. So they're worried about their Islamic flank, if you will. But the problem is, at some point, our factions within the Taliban, between the pragmatists and those that say, we cut a few deals, it's worth it, which side is going to come out? And the Taliban in Kandahar represent a really older generation. Maybe they'll be dying off. Or maybe it will simply be that they will be cut off by the guys running Kabul, saying, you just can't run a government this way. We don't know, because we are not privy to the internal disputes about what's going on. Every kind of place looks united from the outside, but from the inside, quite a number of governors, Taliban governors, are not sympathetic to their masters in Kandahar. There's also going to be a division of spoils kind of problem. Is, do the guys that took over the north and the west, do they feel they're getting a share of power? There's also local problems. You put in Taliban sympathizers, even in a lot of Pashtun areas, they're going to say that's taking jobs away from us, and they're not our relatives. There's all kinds of micro-politics. And one of the biggest things would be the Taliban are at total odds with a population that is one of the youngest in the world. And now, particularly in Kabul's a city of 4 million people, maybe? 500,000 people under the monarchy. What happens if an urban insurgency breaks up? What happens if there's an urban riot and the Taliban say, we'll just put it down with guns? The Taliban maybe have 20,000 people in Kabul. New York City requires 25,000 police, and they don't even have revolts. They could be all dead. And as I say, perception of power is power itself in Afghanistan. If Kabul were to explode and the Taliban be tossed out, I can easily imagine Mazar Sharif and Herat. They would also change their mind. They would also pull the older picture out. It could happen. But again, is it going to happen? Don't know. But there was one riot that took place after an auto accident, I believe it was in 2006 in Afghanistan, that reached the presidential palace. All the police threw off their uniforms and joined the rioters. Karzai he couldn't believe it. He hadn't even done anything. And the next day, it was all gone. But it was kind of a lesson. And particularly in places that have primate centers like Kabul, Tehran, Paris, what happens in the capital sets national politics. If Kabul goes, the rest will switch. It doesn't matter that we hold Kandahar. Good luck. Okay? You won't have a valuable piece of cheese. So in terms of looking at this, again, can it predict it? No. But the Taliban have ruined the life chances of an entire generation in Afghanistan. And at which point, because some people are going to say, we don't have that much to lose. And the Taliban overreact and set in motion a situation they can't control. They may be masters at rural insurgency. I doubt whether they can handle an urban insurgency. Has Afghanistan ever had an urban insurgency? No. That's always a useful place to look in Afghanistan. What has never happened before? Just keep it in the back of your minds. Has Afghanistan ever had a communist government? No. Has it ever been ruled by mullahs? No. And then it happened. So keep an open mind.
So I was wondering, the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, they are being now asked to be settled back in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been in Pakistan for several decades, and they are quite big in numbers. Is that going to lead to some kind of change in dynamic stability or destabilization either ways? And also, second question, I was wondering if the Chinese business interest could fill in potentially the same kind of relationship that you're talking about, foreign powers making Kabul the client state, semi-client state, as they've already done with some success in Pakistan.
Okay, two things on that in terms of China. China is loath to give money. Even in Pakistan, it's all loans. It's all was the Soviets to the Americans, money flowed in to Afghanistan. The Chinese are really loath to subsidize anybody. So that's a problem. Also, the Chinese, and this is true in Pakistan, a lot of Pakistan army is in charge of protecting Chinese projects. They're more concerned about their people being killed by terrorist attacks and other things in Afghanistan than, say, the Americans were. They are very sensitive to that. And security can't be guaranteed for as long as the Islamic State was there. The Islamic State blew up a Chinese hotel. That just to sort of send a message, not easy to do business here. What was the second part of
The other part was about the refugees from Pakistan.
Refugees. Yeah. When the Taliban proved to be uncooperative about the Tariqa Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, Pakistan thought, okay, we too play this game. We will send millions of refugees back. Refugees is a bit of a misnomer because most of them were born in Pakistan. They're technical refugees. But it had no influence because Pakistan thought, okay, this will put a burden on the Afghan government, and the Taliban doesn't care. Are these people suffering? We don't care. Bring in more internationals, bring in the UN to help them out. So it had zero effect on the Afghan Taliban government, but creates more misery inside Afghanistan, but also creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty among Afghan communities in Pakistan, many of whom have close ties or are, in fact, Pashtuns with relatives on the Pakistan side of the border. If this is perceived of as an anti-Pashtun policy, it could, again, it's proved not effective, and God knows Pakistan has enough turmoil right now. It's not clear that it needs this. It's being ineffective. It thinks by deporting all these large numbers of people, they can affect Taliban policy, and it's discovered that it's pushing on a wet noodle. It's not working. And so it's they can continue it. They can create more misery in Afghanistan. But again, as far as the Taliban are concerned, that's God's responsibility to provide, not ours.
Thank you. My name is Tamim Bedar. I'm from Afghanistan, and I lived through at least two of the foreign interventions, the Soviets and the American intervention. And I left Afghanistan after fall of Kabul. So I am a witness to at least to the latest parts of the development. So the U.S. engagement with Afghanistan obviously didn't start after the 9/11. The U.S. government supported the Shah, especially on the western southern side of Afghanistan, with big projects to counterbalance the German and Russian, development aid at that time. And then the Soviet intervention happened and supporting the Mujahideen through Pakistan. And then once the Mujahideen succeeded and Najibullah's government collapsed, there is some kind of understanding in the Afghan society and also among others in the region that the United States just washed its hand and left the region and basically gave the Afghanistan file to the Pakistanis. And then Taliban is a byproduct of delivering that case file to Pakistan. Do you think, given the turbulent history Afghanistan has in terms of maintaining stability, do you think Afghanistan at that juncture in 1990s had a chance to bring back stability like, Dawood Khan in Shah's time, if United States stayed in the region and helped, the different actors broker a deal, given the fact that the Soviet Union was no longer there and United States was the main global power?
Right. The problem was that the United States was supporting the Afghan Mujahideen to cause problems for the Soviet Union. It really didn't care about the Afghans. It's a very cynical type of thing. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, they had no interest. And it's true, they had promised the Afghans, they had promised the Mujahideen, this regime will help you rebuild it. And there was a period, as Gorbachev is pulling the Soviets out, is why don't we try to come up with a coalition government with Kabul is intact, the PDPA army is intact. Let's bring people together and just end this. But the problem was that the Reagan administration, even as Gorbachev is pulling the troops out, always believe it's a Soviet ploy, it's a Soviet trick. They're not leaving, there's some secret thing. We can't trust Najib. If they looked at Najib, certainly from an American point of view, Hekmatyar may have hated the Soviets, Americans are number 2 on his list. They could have seen it's our own interest to cut a deal with the Soviets and cut Pakistan out of it. Pakistan's influence on American policy has always amazed me in terms of that it has always seen Afghanistan through essentially Pakistani eyes. But once the Soviet Union was gone, not only did they not keep up their promises for Afghanistan, they cut off all aid to Pakistan as well. Because they said, oh, Pakistan's making a nuclear weapon and that's against American law. They knew they were making a weapon, but when they didn't need them anymore, it all disappeared. The United States never thought it would be anywhere near Afghanistan ever again. 9/11 took everybody by surprise. And it's one of those questions, America is now out of Afghanistan and we will never be out of there again. Islamic State just blew up and massacred, 100 Russians in Moscow. They're based in Afghanistan. What if that had happened in New York? Is there any politician that would say, sorry, it's Afghanistan? All we got to look is no more state building, but look what the United States did to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It had local allies, didn't intend on state building. If the U.S. goes back, those little regional sections I talked to, make alliances with the people of the North and the West, go after ISIS, and screw who's ruling Kabul. Not our business. If you look at how the United States does counterinsurgent or counterterrorism anymore, the new model is not building a state. It's allying with factions within a state like the Kurds or others, letting them do the business. We help organize it, but we're not concerned with building a larger state or a larger economy. So I don't expect to see Afghanistan or United States back in Afghanistan again. But on the other hand, I would not say that it's outside the realm of possibilities, because nobody expected that we'd be there in 2001. When Bush went to the Pentagon and said, "What's our plan for invading Afghanistan?" Because we believe the Pentagon has plans for invading Iraq. We don't have a plan. It'll take 6 months. So I can't wait that long. So he goes to the CIA. They said, "Yeah, we know a bunch of Afghans. They'll do it." Okay. The Obama administration, it was the same thing. Keep the American army out of it. Just deal with the factions that also, your enemy, my enemy, we're allies. That could happen. I could see, central Afghanistan, northern Afghanistan saying, "Welcome. You want a drone base here? It's here." So it's the kind of thing that, yeah, there was a possibility before the Najib government fell, in which an attempt at reconciliation, which actually Najib had attempted, with some support from the United States to bring in the Mujahideen factions. The thing is, their faction leaders in Pakistan were adamantly opposed to this. But their followers and the people who fought inside Afghanistan, like Ishmael Khan or Ahmad Shah Massoud, they might have been up for this if there were certain guarantees. So Afghanistan, there was a missing opportunity that Afghanistan could have avoided a decade of civil war, could have avoided the Taliban. It's one of those things that did not happen, again, because the U.S. had this Cold War mentality that stopped it from thinking at all creatively. Partially because they said there'll never be a consequence for us. And one of the things 9/11 should have taught them is, you may not think there's a consequence, or as I've said before, you can forget about Afghanistan. Afghanistan won't forget about you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Barfield, for joining us today. So you discussed the concept of Swiss cheese model, to an extent regarding government style and politics on the ground in Afghanistan. So in contemporary world and in current Afghanistan, so what kind of state structure you think might work? Centralized, tribalism system maybe? And if you have a preferences among one of them, so what are some prerequisites for?
Well, it's a great irony that the United States is the oldest federal republic in the world, and we go abroad, we create autocracies. That's wish fulfillment by American presidents. I often say, here in Kentucky, you're in the middle, but Massachusetts and Mississippi are two entirely different kinds of people when they think politically. But we have the federal government as a referee. You can carry all the guns you want in Texas. Don't walk on the streets of Boston with an AK-47. We will arrest you. We elect our own governors. They represent our points of view. You want a fundamentalist Christian in Alabama? Go ahead. In Afghanistan, with a highly centralized government, all the governors, everybody is appointed by the center. They have no relation. And I said, at the time, what if Donald Trump had made Ivanka governor of California and Jared the governor of Massachusetts? Well, we'd have an insurgency too. All right? Is we avoid that by providing a lot of local law. Our states are actually sovereign. The one case that Trump can't pardon himself is New York, because New York has its own courts. He is guilty. He is a felon. All these federal cases, I pardon myself. He can stop any federal case. He cannot stop that case in Jordan and Georgia about election interference. He doesn't have the ability. In Afghanistan, if you're a governor, you had to, how's this going to look to the palace? And the government made sure that nobody establish close relationships with their own population. The exceptions to this, like Atta and Mazar, they built up a very strong polity, and Kabul was afraid to get rid of them. And the government said, Ashraf Ghani, they're stealing revenue. Yeah, they are, but they're spending it locally, right? A lot of politics, particularly in the United States, yeah, we have corrupt politicians, but there's two kinds of corruption. There's state building corruption, where you steal the money and you spend it to gain power, and there's state destroying corruption, where you get power in order to steal as much money as possible. And Afghanistan was all state destroying corruption. You don't create networks. You don't create viable parties. You don't get infrastructure. And that's what happened. It's not just there was corruption in Afghanistan, it was the particular kind of state destroying corruption, because nobody cares. It comes from the outside. There's plenty of, China's incredibly corrupt. Xi Jinping's constantly throwing party leaders in jail. But there's factories in China. Stuff is happening in China, because that's how people are building their political bases. So in Afghanistan, what I would say is the governor of Herat, or Western Afghanistan, should probably be a Harati. And not only that, there's like 34 provinces in Afghanistan. That was Afghanistan's the size of France, the size of Texas. That was deliberately done so that no province could be very important. Late 19th century, only 4 provinces. All of the West was under Herat. All of the North was under Mazar. You don't have to, United States, we have a lot of states. The federal government, look at your dollar bills. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Those are the regions that the federal government does business in. We have political states, but we work with regions. There's lots of things that Afghanistan could do, and actually the United States had one of the best templates, because we have a lot of experience with people who are quite different than one another, and yet see some kind of common unity. And I would argue the Afghans have a tremendous amount of unity among themselves, because when they're refugees in Pakistan and Iran, they see we're definitely not Iranian, we're definitely not Pakistani. So all the differences that people argue about within Afghanistan, when they leave Afghanistan, say, we actually have a lot more in common. The question is, how do you manage the smaller differences? As long as it's a zero-sum game of a highly centralized government, then it's either we're insurgents or we run the government. There's no reason to compromise, because if your enemy gets in, he will take all the power. In a federal republic, one part of the country can fail and the rest can go about successfully. In Afghanistan, when the center fails, everything fails. And people argue, well, but if everything succeeds, then everybody succeeds. Yeah, it's very rare that you get somebody that's able to have that kind of autocratic power and make things work. But I would also, historically, going all the way back to the Persian Empire, is Afghanistan successfully run by being divided into these really old districts that have economic, ethnic cohesion. Afghanistan has no majority group as a nation, but every region has a majority group. So you're less concerned about who's running the government, central government, which ethnic group is running the central government, if you control your own region. There's certain things that that they've got to do with your cooperation. And that has not been true. Every single government, back to Abdurrahman, is the idea, Kabul über alles. And whenever foreigners invade, the Afghans that they assist say, this is the only way to bring stability to Afghanistan. At least 4 governments of that model have fallen in the past 100 years. You would think, if this is so good, why has it failed every single time? And so for those people who say, the country would fall apart if it was federal, listen, the country would have fallen apart already if there wasn't something holding it together, some kind of dark political matter that it's holding it together. Recognize what makes the country strong and go with it. Don't fight against it. But if you're trying to impose an ideology, then you want a highly centralized government and tell everybody what to do. The problem is no central government in Afghanistan, unlike, say, the Soviet Union under Stalin, has had the ability to say it's our way or no way. Afghanistan has inserted itself. No government, even with the support of superpowers, has had the ability to do that.
Okay, we can take both of them maybe both ask questions, then we have one final response. To
I think we're just a lot of information here on just a new area to me, but I'm worried about social media. In terms of Afghanistan, I don't even know what the situation is, and does it have an impact like it does here in the States, and how is social media affecting this conversation?
I have a very basic question. I was just struck by the fact that you're saying that it's not remunerated to govern Afghanistan, so why to govern? Is it just like other people from governing it?
Okay, two things. Actually, there's a lot of social media in Afghanistan. Everybody has cell phones. Social media is run through cell phones, but it's one of the youngest populations in the world. I think 2/3 of the population is like under 25, and there's universities that are running. Girls can't go to school, but they do attend universities remotely. It's like there's a lot, and a lot of the opposition to the Taliban or other things, it shows up on social media. So they're very tied into social media. It's they really, for a country that had like 0 phone lines, landlines, it made this jump. And because the cellular services, they're all private companies, and the government is one of the few parts of the economy that paid taxes to the government. The private companies drove down the cost of using the cell phones really low, and made it really, really easy. So Afghanistan was, so when it comes to communications technology, surprisingly advanced. The nomads that I lived with occasionally would call me up, wish me a happy New Year's and stuff. It's like, yeah, because if you use WhatsApp, it doesn't cost you anything to call the United States. It's like, go ahead and do it. It's made Afghanistan far more international than it used to be, but even domestically, the opposition to the Taliban shows up. And the Taliban would cease to function if WhatsApp was turned off. Their entire government communication runs through WhatsApp. So, second, I believe you go back to that boring Musahaban dynasty. Technically, that was a highly centralized government, but informally, they recognized that people need to organize their own ways of living. Afghanistan is eminently governable on a cooperative basis. Afghanistan wouldn't even have the money to have these civil wars if outsiders weren't constantly interfering. And Afghanistan also, more than, I would say 80-90% of disputes in Afghanistan, and this was even the past 20 years, are handled informally by mediation and arbitration, not by courts. There are no people in the world that are better at resolving disputes, including blood feuds and other things, than the Afghans are. At the local level, when government collapses in places like Yugoslavia or other places, all hell breaks loose at the local level, right? There's killing everywhere, not in Afghanistan, because at the local level, all politics is personal. And what we find is, as one of my friends said, yeah, you may have the power to kill somebody now, but do you have enough power to avoid revenge for the next 20 years? If you don't think so, then maybe you shouldn't kill. And so we do not find the levels of atrocities that we see, for example, in parts of West Africa or other places, because there's a local price to be paid for this. And people have very long memories. And strangely enough, it would seem almost counterintuitive, it actually stops bad actors from being as bad as they could be. Because again, if you never had a 911, if you never called the police ever, if you handle your own disputes, then the central government collapses, you know how to handle local affairs. It's not going to create anarchy at the bottom. It is, as far as many people are concerned, anarchy comes when the government arrives. So it's one of the reasons that they tend to be sort of suspicious of government institutions.
All right, we're going to begin one more time. Thank you, Dr. Barfield, for being with us today. And as a couple of small tokens, we have our usual CAD sort of swag to use a sign of thanks, a notebook and pen for a field researcher, the essential, and then
And a bag.
everybody could use a bag and water, important too. That'll get you through the country. So thanks so much for being here. For everybody here and online, we're just getting started for this semester. So keep an eye on website, email list, and flyers and all that. Our next talk will be Sarah Khan joining us to talk about gender and politics in Pakistan, actually, which we're very excited about. And that will be on February 12th, I believe. And then just to flag for later in the semester on March 31st, we'll have our annual lecture, which is a little less of a scholarly talk and a little more of a public event, where we're going to be having one of the transitional leaders from Bangladesh, who's in charge of reforming that country's electoral system, traveling from Dhaka to Louisville to give our annual lecture where he'll talk about political reform after that country's monsoon revolution. So there'll be lots of further info on that, but March 31st is the date for that. There'll be more as well. Thanks so much again for being here. Appreciate it.